Welcome to Open BxRx Tuesday on BronxNet. I'm your host, Kibin Alleyne, and I'd like to invite you to get social with us at BronxNet TV on Instagram and Twitter, and BronxNet Community Television on Facebook. Following a series of tragic mass shootings across our country and gun violence in New York City, elected leaders have come together to address our state gun laws. New York State Assembly member Kenny Burgos joins me to discuss the nation's most comprehensive gun package and his effort to protect the people of New York. But before we start the interview, let's take a look at this clip of Assembly member Burgos.
People are losing their lives to gun violence, from mass shootings in small towns to stray bullets in big cities. We have a responsibility, a sacred duty as leaders to those that we serve to make every effort within our power to preserve lives and ensure safety, because thoughts and prayers are not enough. The crisis of gun violence requires action, and yet 90% of the debate I've heard tonight is the impact these bills will have on hunting. In what world is hunting wildlife more important than preserving human life?
Assemblymember Burgos, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Now, in that video, you stated that gun violence crisis requires action, and you were a part of that action. Can you tell me about the gun safety legislation package?
Yeah, thank you. We passed here in New York, I just want to say about 2 weeks after that horrible Buffalo shooting, the most comprehensive gun package that we saw here in the United States. Part of that package with my bill was up to expand the definition of a firearm. We had gun manufacturers who were getting disturbingly creative and essentially creating guns that would fall outside of the definition of a firearm. But thanks to that package of gun laws, I think New Yorkers can rest easier to be a little bit safer now.
Now, two focus points in the package focus on social media, which I think is truly amazing. And it's a modern way to address these issues. Can you further expand on that and what they are?
Well, yeah, like you said, modern problems require modern solutions, and I think for too long our government has been a bit late to the game in finding these solutions. But it's very clear that a lot of the threats that we've had in our country have stemmed from social media, whether the inspiration is from social media or just the sharing of ideas and processes. So part of our package requires these social media companies to give us a plan to address threats of mass harm, to really address this issue head on and make sure we don't have another one of these scenarios happening here in New York.
So we know that gun violence is a countrywide issue, but we are also seeing the effects of gun violence in our borough. Can you explain how this violence is impacting the Bronx specifically?
I think if you're a Bronxite, you're no stranger to gun violence, unfortunately, whether directly or indirectly. I get emails, calls about shootings in my district, unfortunately, what feels like almost weekly. We lost the life of 11-year-old Kiara Tay just last month to gun violence. So this is a very real issue. This is the number one concern in my district and in so many communities throughout the Bronx. So this is why we had to pass this gun package. This is why we have to address gun violence head on.
Why do you think it's taken so long for us to find a solution to this problem?
It's difficult because gun violence is an issue that it's not only within the borders of our borough or our city. I think New York State has done, at this point, almost as much as we can in terms of penal law, criminal law, resources to prevent gun violence. But we have been saying for a long, long time, the federal government has to step in. And I'm happy to see that after 30 years, 30 long years after we've seen so many mass shootings from Columbine to Parkland to Buffalo to Pulse nightclub. I mean, we can go on and on with this list. But 30 years later, the federal government is poised to present the most comprehensive gun package on a federal level. Because we know guns and criminals don't abide by state lines. We can have the strongest laws here in our state right here, but unfortunately someone can drive over to Pennsylvania and come back with guns before sunset. And that's not going to protect New Yorkers here. So I'm hoping the federal package will be more comprehensive and just keep our entire country a lot safer from the issues of gun violence.
Now, this has been a long time issue and a debate, in our country for a very long time. Can you tell us, what were some obstacles in getting that passed? I know there were certain parties who were kind of against this and feel like their amendment rights are kind of being toyed around with. Can you further explain what that's all about?
Yeah, well, you played the clip a bit earlier in my debate when we passed this gun package bill. And much of the debate that we had with our colleagues across the aisle was the concern about the impact that our laws would have on hunting. And I had a lot more passion that night, but it still rings true. There's just no world where we have to preserve hunting more than preserving human life. People are losing their lives. I have kids losing their lives to guns in my district, and that is the number one concern we should be leading with. But like you said, so up there, they're debating on the issues. These gun bills will change to their hunting. In the national level, people are trying to protect the Second Amendment. And this is not an assault on the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment is still the right to bear arms, but we're saying that that bill, that amendment was drawn up 200 plus years ago. The founding fathers were not aware of the kind of damage, the kind of weapons that we would have designed today. So we have to make sure we have these solutions that address the real problems we have today, and not just stand by one sentence created by some guys 250 years ago.
I like that you said that, because I feel like a lot of people don't really think about like the time, these things were put in place, and we're kind of in a different world now. So I'm kind of happy that you brought that up. Now, the gun violence we're seeing in our city is different from other states because most of the time they are illegal guns. Will this legislation address ghost guns?
So we addressed ghost gun legislation a few months back in the legislature, but this legislation also, depending what your definition of ghost gun is, right? In my bill, like I stated, you had guns that were not defined as a firearm. I would consider that a ghost gun. But now with this package, we have captured pretty much any sort of design manufacturers will come up with, and it will be defined as a firearm, and then it will fall under all the other laws that will associate with that. So to simply answer, yes, we're addressing ghost guns. We know it's one of the biggest issues we're facing right here in New York City, and it's at the forefront of our focus.
What are some other solutions our city and our country can take to alleviate the issue of gun violence? And, whether that's mental health resources, more jobs, stuff like that.
There's a saying that I heard once that I think rings clear. Nothing stops a bullet better than a jump. Right? So we have, like we stated, some of the best laws against guns, against firearms here in New York. Like I said, with the federal laws coming into place, that will be hugely helpful. But that's not to say that this is a quote-unquote silver bullet that will stop gun violence in its tracks. How do we stop gun violence? Gun violence is a result of poverty. It's a result of crime. It's a result of lack of resources in communities that for so long have lacked these resources. So now that we have these laws in the books, it's up to our state, up to our city, and our federal government to make sure those communities that have been most impacted, communities like mine and Soundview, have those anti-gun violence programs, have these mental health dollars to address individuals who may want to get their hands on a gun in some time, but we want to address that at the root cause. Put more money into education. These are the problems that you solve holistically that then indirectly, but yet directly solve gun violence down the road.
And it kind of reminds me of when AOC kind of talked about, she said something about like, police, defunding the police. And, the reason why our communities are struggling is not because of, just people who want to do crime. It's the lack of resources that we have. Do you feel that more elected leaders understand this and truly want to help lower income communities or just communities that are really struggling with violence?
Yeah, I think we have a wave of new elected officials in the past few years, and they recognize that when we look at some of these line items, we just have to put more money in there. Again, I have schools in my area that have the same textbooks for 10 years. I have schools that I went to that the auditoriums haven't changed, cafeterias haven't changed, and people may look at me and say, hey, Kenny, how does that solve gun violence? Now, it may be hard to draw that direct line connection, but when a child, when an individual, when people in these communities grow up and they have the best, and I mean the best and the most, up-to-date and greatest resources, they're going to be on a much better path going forward, whether that leads for their education or their job or their family life, their health. And all of this is how communities are designed. So we just have to focus on where we're putting our money at and making sure that it's working to the best of our abilities.
Now, what can residents of New York do to hold our leaders accountable for the promises made in regards to our safety?
Well, like I said, I get calls, texts, people stop me on the street, and the number one concern almost every time is public safety, it's gun violence. And I welcome it. And what I tell people, continue that. Don't just tell me. Tell your other local leaders, tell your Congress members, tell your mayor, tell your governor. Keep that pressure on, and if every New Yorker can mount that pressure on our lawmakers, then we'll surely get stuff done the same way we've done this session. But you have to keep that pressure mounted. And it's not to say that we need pressure to get work done, but unfortunately, you have some communities that just don't wear the same weight that like, a community like mine does, where gun violence is so prevalent. You may not have that same prevalence in somewhere in an upstate community, so it's not the number one concern. But if we get New Yorkers to really pressure on and say, hey, this is our number one problem, and we need to address countrywide, statewide, borough-wide, citywide, your lawmakers will respond.
Now, we have about a few minutes left. I really want to talk about something that we recently spoke on. We talked about how a lot of the time, a lot of these perpetrators are male. And I just want to know, like, as a young male, like, what advice or what do you hope to see that we could provide to these young men so they're not going on the path to kind of causing terror and committing crime in our communities?
Yeah, it's disheartening to hear that, and it's absolutely true. The unfortunate reality is most of these crimes are perpetrated by males. A male who grew up in the Bronx, I've seen it firsthand. Right? I've had friends I see all the time that them and I kind of went on separate paths in life, and you can kind of always trace that back to some point in their childhood. So, what the conversations we're having is that all these programs that we have to address not just childhood poverty and lack of housing, healthcare, education, you name it, it can't just be geared towards children as a whole. We now have to get the experts in and really start targeting towards the males, right? We need programs, we need money to be targeted towards the male population, who we know, unfortunately, is the ones that are growing up and committing these crimes. So we need the experts to really weigh in here and try to dig deep into that issue and hopefully solve it for years to come.
All right, Kenny, thank you so much for joining me. Can you let everybody know how they can stay up to date with you?
Yeah, all my social media is the same handle. It's at Kenny Burgos NY. So that's Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Feel free to follow me, DM me, tweet me. I try to be as responsive and accessible as possible. So stay tuned.
We'll be right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday.